Ed here with the Digital Digest, and today I wanted to share a quick video about the Sony A6300. Now, as you may have noticed, I've got the A7R Mark II with the Zeiss f4 16-35 wide-angle lens attached to it. Of course, that is a full-frame E-mount lens, native to full-frame. Whereas to the right, the A6300 has a native E-mount aps-c lens, the wide-angle zoom 10 to 18 millimeter f4 lens. Now, of course, when dealing with aps-c as opposed to full frame, there is a crop factor. So even though this is a 10 to 18 f4 in the full frame world, it isn't. But all of that aside, today's video, even though I already mentioned it's a comparison, because it is about how well these cameras ultimately really complement one another. And I say that because it is true. So the A7R Mark II is a $3,200, that is US, body alone without any glass attached to it. If you decide to add a lens like this one, it's $1,350 US dollars. The Zeiss 24 to 70 is $1,200. The 70 to 200 f4 is $1,500. And then the new the Master Series lenses, well, those are all pretty much $1,800 US and up, whether we're talking about the 85 or the brand new 24 to 70, which is going to be, I believe, $2,300. And then last but not least, the new f2.8 70 to 200, which is going to be likely over $3,000 US. Of course, in the aps-c E-mount world, lenses are much more affordable, and that's part of why these two cameras complement each other very well. Also, because both of them are E-mount based, the lenses are interchangeable. So even though we have a digital imaging beast on the left that is best in class, and you certainly pay for that best in class imaging, on the right we have, I won't say the opposite because it's not, it's still a very solid 24 megapixel aps-c sensor, but you don't sacrifice video quality. It has both 4K, full 4K at 30p, 100 megabits per second, but also Super 35. So very similar to the A7R Mark II, you have that flexibility to jump to either mode. Of course, with this one, no pixel binning in the Super 35, which is a great feature. Also, the A6300 has slow motion video that the A7R Mark II simply does not have. The A6300 can do 120 frames per second at 1080p resolution. You will have to drop down to the traditional XAVC-S, but that is a big plus in the A6300's favor, beyond the fact that it is far more affordable. I mean, again, $3,200 for this body, $1,000 for this one. And then, of course, the form factor. The A6300 is, substantially smaller, as are the lenses that you will be purchasing for it. Now, even though, of course, this Zeiss lens can be put on this body, you would rather use native E-mount aps-c lenses than full frame, but that by no way, shape, or form prevents you from using something like this lens on here. It's just you're not going to get the full lens. You're going to get a cropped version of it. So it's really a matter of personal preference. That's why I like the flexibility that this pairing represents. So even though this is a comparison, again, 42 megapixels, 24, they both do UHD, aka 4K video capture. The A7R Mark II did have overheating problems at inception. It no longer does. The A6300 has none. Clearly, Sony learned from this camera that was something that could no longer be an issue on the table, and they have resolved that here with the A6300. It may have to do something with the copper wire sensor solution that they used here in the A6300. I'm not quite sure exactly what it is, but the more important element is that overheating is not an issue for either of these cameras. And then you can see where they share design cues, whether it's the on-off switch or the actual shutter button being so similar. Of course, the mode dial, a little bit different. Here you have a lock on the mode dial. Here you do not. And then there is a dedicated exposure compensation right here, whereas here we have, again, a similar layout, closer together, the two dials, but that is programmable. Also, on the front of the A7R, we have another programmable dial that is below the shutter button, something we do not have on the A6300. But even the fit and finish, the actual material finish of the two bodies has become increasingly similar. If you notice, they have the exact same pattern and they feel very similar in terms of build quality, which is a really good thing if you are going for the less expensive A6300, because all of a sudden what you've selected seems like a value play, and it is. Both have Wi-Fi and NFC, for those of you that are curious. The A6300, definitely the, I would say, better performer when it comes to its form factor. That doesn't take anything away from the A7R, but many of the fans of Sony's mirrorless camera business were not off-put by this design, but found it to be a little bit retroactive in that the footprint of the full-frame monster that this is did get significantly larger from the previous generation, meaning the original A7 and A7R. Here, with the A6300, we also got larger than the A6000 or NEX6 before that, or any other previous model, the NEX7, their top-of-the-line aps-c, back when it came out in 2012. But even though this has gotten a little bit larger, it still maintains a form factor that's really in another class, not just because of the sensor that's inside, but for every other reason as well. It is physically about, I would say, half of the size of the A7R Mark II, then take into account the lenses that are literally 2 to 3 times the size, and you start to understand why these complement each other well. Previously, I had no Sony option for an alternate camera that had 4K video capture, as well as improved autofocus. That is something that the A6300 has an edge over the A7R Mark II. 425 points of phase detection, 168 of contrast, which equates to Sony's 4D focus system. You do not have that in the A7R Mark II. You have a solid 5 frames per second, I would say accurate 425 points of phase detection, as well as contrast, so there is still a hybrid system in play, but it simply isn't as accurate, and that's what I'm going to refer to it as the A6300. And that has to do a lot with the fact that there's also high-density tracking of subject, something you don't have here. Both have eye autofocus, which is a great feature from Sony. The A6300 can be powered via a battery pack, which is another nice enhancement. I already mentioned the A7R Mark II does not have the slow-motion HD video, but if you're a pro, I don't know that I think it's a nice thing to have, but it's not necessarily a game breaker, in my opinion. Of course, that will be different for every user. However, the EVFs on both of these cameras are amazing, both OLED based and both best in the business. Whether we're talking about in the full frame world, this EVF is simply fantastic, or if we're talking about in the aps-c world. And I say that because these are the only viewfinders out there that will make you feel like you're looking through an optical viewfinder. And that is critical if you rely on a viewfinder as opposed to shooting off of a live view LCD screen. Also, the live view or life view that they use here with the EVF, essentially when you're looking and you snap a shot, it just basically, reproduces what a shutter would. And for a second, you see a black flash, and then you're right back to your wide field of view. Both of these cameras have an incredible wide field of view on their EVFs. Again, both LED-based, OLED-based, and really best in the business. They both have similar LCDs on the back, something I want to show you right now, the back of each camera. And again, you can see the size. I mean, the A7R Mark II does make the A6300 look like basically a baby version of this camera. Whether we come down to the side where the video button is, or the general layout of the different buttons on the back of the camera, they are very, very similar. Of course, the body actual surface area is the key differentiating factor for where both the buttons are going to go, as well as the viewfinder. I personally prefer the center-mounted viewfinder. It makes it easier for both left and right eye dominant users alike to use one camera, as opposed to here where whether you're left or right eye dominant really is disregarded. But because it's a less expensive camera, it makes sense. It's more oriented towards being for the masses, and Sony is less worried about whether or not you favor your left or right eye. Now, for me personally, I favor my left eye, so using this viewfinder is a little bit more difficult than this one. Some people complain that they press their face into the screen. I don't have that issue. I guess it depends on what your face literally looks like. But The overall experience with both of these cameras is fantastic. I mean, the A7R Mark II was basically heralded as the best digital imaging device ever made when it launched, and then only got better once it got a firmware update that resolved, as I mentioned before, the overheating issue. The A6300 picked up exactly where this camera left off, except it adds, as I've already mentioned, improved EVF, improved autofocus, improved video capabilities, both with the UHD as well as the 120 frames per second, and then also the ability to output clean 4K, something this camera can do as well. Of course, it is a pro-grade camera, but here we're not dealing with a pro-grade camera. There's a mic input here, which was not present on the previous generation. You also have, of course, HDMI and micro USB port for charging, Sony's multi-port, which is also found on the A7R Mark II, and that is also very versatile in that you can now charge this using a battery pack instead of relying on the W series batteries. Now, both of these cameras use the W series battery, and I'll let you know that's another nice thing about carrying both of them is that you don't need a different battery. You've got one battery for both beasts. The downside is the battery life isn't great on either. I mean, you're looking at over 300 shots with either of these cameras, but once you get into the 4K video realm, whether we're talking about at 30p full frame, or in this case, 30p full sensor, or going to Super 35, I would say that you're looking at killing half a battery easily with 29 minutes of video capture. So both of these cameras, which was pretty much predictable in my opinion, eat batteries for breakfast when it comes to shooting UHD video. However, everything else they do relatively well. The batteries, by the way, also are not that expensive. Of course, if you buy retail Sony batteries, they're $50 a piece, but you can find third-party batteries for a significant discount. Some people won't touch them. They're worried about what they could do to the cameras. Sony, of course, will not recommend that because it takes money out of their pocket. But ultimately, again, the idea is fairly simple, which is that both of these cameras can take the same battery form, which means you only need one battery type if these are the two cameras you travel with, either as a professional, amateur, or just a hobbyist. So right now, I'm really pleased with the A6300. For those of you that have been following my coverage, you know that already. But ultimately, what is most satisfying is that now I have an aps-c counterpart to the A7R Mark II that simply didn't exist before. I had the A6000, and as much as I loved it, and its autofocus, was essentially unmatched in the business, especially by the A7R Mark II, there was not really a place for it in my bag because I was at a point here, not only in 2016, but in 2015, where I expected my still imaging device, aka the A7R Mark II, and its counterparts to be able to capture 4K video, UHD video. That was something the A6000 couldn't do. And whether I look at competition like Samsung, which is now out of the business, I mean, I did review the NX500, but it's been discontinued. Samsung is out of the camera game. So if you invested money in that, you ate the early adopter price on that because they left the business. Here, you don't have to worry about that. You have a mature E-mount lineup as well as third-party lenses that are out there. Again, the reason I use both of these is because they're both wide angle and they serve a very good purpose of demonstrating the vast difference in full frame glass as opposed to aps-c glass in the E-mount world native from Sony. Another thing that has to be noted, both have an electronic shutter mode, a silent mode, so that they will emit no noise. It does slow down performance, but in-body stabilization, an incredible thing for the A7R Mark II. It does render footage that is handheld shot almost to seem like as if it's on a rig. When combined with Sony's FE native lenses that also have optical steady shot on board, utilizing all 5 axes of stabilization. The A6300 does not have that benefit, and it makes sense. No aps-c mirrorless cameras from Sony have ever had in-body stabilization, and even though a lot of customers wanted to see that happen here with this generation, as I mentioned before, it makes sense that Sony kept it a feature only found in their professional line of full-frame cameras. The A6300 relies on the lens, so it will require more stabilization if you are video-centric, but the idea, as I've mentioned throughout this video, is the same. You have lenses that will work with both cameras, and you have characteristics that are very much the same. The menus will read out the same, which they do. Performance, very similar. Ultimately, obviously, the 42 megapixel full frame sensor is a completely different animal than the 24 megapixel aps-c. And here, but the feature set, capability, those are incredibly similar. And that's what makes these two cameras great complementary devices. And frankly, you're pretty much looking at my gear bag now. Yes, I still use my RX100 Mark IV. It's a great pocket camera. But now that the A6300 is out, which has basically everything that the RX100 Mark IV has in a slightly larger package, but the ability to use all of my E-mount lenses, I have less of an excuse to even garner an RX100 any longer, because now we have a body that isn't that much larger that can do just about everything. And that is the beauty of the new A6300. And pricing is similar also. You know, $1,000 for the body, $1,150 for the kit. The RX100 Mark IV is $950. If you step up to the RX10 Mark II, you're looking at over $1,000. You're spending more than this camera costs. So that's another thing that has to be taken into account. You know, those of you that are wondering, is this a good competing camera or model for the RX10 Mark II? Again, the RX100, the entire CyberShot line is about convenience. Anything interchangeable is aimed at the opposite. It's aimed at growth. It's aimed at you having the utility and also flexibility to change, put any lens on the camera that you could possibly want. And I don't just mean Sony, I mean any lens, because with adapters, you can actually leave the autofocus system intact. So again, the A7R Mark II and the A6300 are pretty much the cameras I've been waiting for from Sony since they really started to flex their Konica Minolta muscle in the camera business, which they acquired ages ago now. It seems like yesterday, but it's ages ago at this point. I remember my last Konica Minolta bridge camera, which was fantastic, but it's so long ago that it seems ancient. And here before us, we now have a professional-grade digital imaging device that can take on the best of Canon and Nikon, and now in the form of a small form factor, basically a baby A7R Mark II, the A6300, we have the option for the masses that, granted, it's still expensive, but the compromise is extraordinarily limited because you are getting the best of both worlds in the mirrorless non-full frame realm. And whether we look at Fuji, whether we look at Panasonic, Canon, Nikon, no one really has all of the boxes checked and has grown their mirrorless business the way Sony has. So even though I am a fan of what Sony has done, it's not simply because I'm a Sony fan, it's because they've done it better than anyone else. So these are two great cameras. Again, very similar, very different in terms of price, very different in terms of overall output, but both represent a great complementary product to the other if you are an E-mount user like myself. So A7R Mark II is a winner, as is the brand new A6300. Really, I have no complaints. You know, they both set the standard, the bar, at a whole new level for the digital imaging business. Any questions or comments, please feel free to post them. Hit that like button and please subscribe. Why not? Later.